Ahead on this week's edition, we look at the issue of money laundering, that act of hiding the source and/or destination of illegally obtained funds. Is the government doing enough to curb this vice, and what does it portend for the Kenyan economy if it is left to continue unabated? Also in the program, we visit an entrepreneur in Thika who is using locally available material, that's wood, to make sockets and improve the lives of people around him. That and your question answered. Good evening and welcome to this edition of KTN Business Weekly. I'm Michael Oyer. Member of Parliament Chris Okemo and former Managing Director of the Kenya Power and Lighting Company, Samuel Gishuru, have surrendered their passports to the courts and cannot travel out of the country following an application by the island of Jersey that the two be prosecuted on charges of corruption and money laundering. This is the first major case in Kenya and may very well set a precedent for other cases that could follow. Our feature looks at the larger issue of money laundering, its effects on the economy, and why the government must act and be seen to act to rein in the vice.
2011 will go down in history as the year when one of the major thresholds in the fight against money laundering in Kenya was crossed. The move by the island of Jersey to instigate extradition proceedings against two prominent Kenyans, bearing testimony to and setting a precedent for a war that has for a long time been fought but very little achieved. But is the war against money laundering important? Is it even necessary? Is Kenya in any way really affected by money laundering?
Kenya most definitely is affected. We have all sorts of illegal inflows and outflows. We have a significant problem of corruption in public procurement, and the Treasury itself estimates it at being something like between 20 to 25% of the procurement budget gets stolen or wasted or is misappropriated.
It would then seem that to a point money laundering and the corruption that engenders it are institutionalized in this country. Cryptically, the 30th June 2011 edition of the Law Journal, the Nairobi Law Monthly, reaches the same conclusion, as it chronicles one such caper and the efforts that have been made over decades to remove the hegemony that often results. Indeed, the Parliamentary Hansard itself bears testimony to one such parliamentary debate a decade ago that resulted in the sinking of a law that sought to introduce transparency in Kenya through elimination of nominee accounts in company ownership and the provision of a legal framework for information sharing between governments. To date, nominee accounts remain a key entry point for money laundering into the economy. According to the Nairobi Law Monthly and the Parliamentary Hansard, on the afternoon of November the 18th, 1999, after a heated parliamentary session that debated female circumcision, broken toilets in Mundanyi prison, and police harassment of a tourist, the then Finance Minister Chris Okemo, the legislator from Nambale, finally got a chance to tackle the weighty matter before a committee of the whole House. In what has been described as swordplay between Mr. Okemo, then MP Owino Chola, and the then North Mugirango legislator Henry Obocha, who were questioning the minister's intention in seeking to delete various sections of the Banking Act to the Finance Act, the finance minister effectively crippled anti-money laundering legislation in the country for another decade. Fast forward some 1 dozen years, and with the current extradition proceedings underway, and with some quarters possibly trying to right past wrongs, it is important that correct precedents are set.
Knowing how corruption in this country seems to be done with impunity, I would suggest that even in the present, it's very likely that you have similar schemes, all of which would require, once you've taken the money, it has to be cleaned up in some way. And typically you'd be investing it in real estate or other ventures which can appear legitimate.
And with the country mired in corruption and proceeds from crime and corruption then finding their way into the economy, both government and private sector have become conduits for dirty money.
The biggest place where money is laundered is through the real estate and the government, large government projects. Civil servants are used by people from outside to come in and they then are given contracts to supply because they have the money at the end of the day to supply the goods that the government wants, because government may actually require very large volumes of certain goods so that they can give services to the people. And unscrupulous people will actually come in, supply the goods, and then they're paid, through the bank. And that interferes with the economic growth. In fact, it distorts what we believe to be, the state of the economy.
Various forms of the money laundering vice are thus prevalent here. The first and simplest is placement. This is the act of moving the ill-gotten funds into a financial institution. Observers already point out that Kenya is mostly a cash economy, making this practice prevalent. Not even banking know your customer rules have been able to stem the tide.
And Kenya actually is also a very large cash economy, so it is also very possible to manipulate that tendency or that culture for people to insert money into the system or even take it out.
When you have a lot of cash being injected into the country without much control by the central bank, we end up having inflation creeping in, and that affects the economy of the country.
Yet another practice is layering, which involves creating proxies and using various institutions like banks and law firms, asset managers and trustee services to avoid detection of ownership.
You look at the stock exchange, blue chip companies, the major shareholders or nominee companies, all this kind of layering or concealment of identity of beneficial owners is conducive to money laundering. Not to say that every nominee account is suspicious, but the point is that the world is moving towards more and more transparency.
The illegal practice of integration, also called cleaning, is the most prevalent in Kenya. This especially in government circles, as government procurement forms the largest segment of business in Kenya. In integration, the illegal funds are accounted for by adjusting a legitimate transaction. For instance, ordinary goods may be sold for a particular price, but the invoice will value them much higher.
So you find that a lot of people who come with money from drugs, pirates, and all other sources of funds which are black in nature would then go to the government and say, we have the capacity to supply you with certain services or goods. And they say that in order to pay us, we'll bring the services or goods, but pay us through the banks. At the end of the day, nobody really asks, where did you get money to buy the goods that you're supplying the government?
With the problem having a historical perspective and with laws having been enacted, but little done to operationalize or enact them, the lack of political will by the establishment is thus apparent.
In Kenya, we've got a long-standing history of disguising beneficial ownership. So it's not so much that we can't change that. It's that even though all the right noises are being made, legislation is being passed, we don't move fast enough. And in big business and with big volumes, every day counts. So, if you want to stop bad practices, you stop them today. You don't say we'll stop them progressively.
With the country and its economy then firmly in the hands and firmly at the mercy of these lords of impunity, a clear way forward then needs to be charted.
I think the way forward for people who have benefited from corrupt activities which have actually messed up this economy, we should actually name and shame them so that the public knows, and all the businesses that they are engaged in should be identified so that any ordinary person should avoid the products which are coming from those companies, because that's, according to me, that will be a very good way of making sure that somebody does not benefit from corruption.
But because individuals complicit in the money laundering game are mostly able to influence public opinion in more than one way, or in one way or another, a wide variety of intervention measures have to work in tandem if anything of note is to be achieved to halt them in their strides.
The way forward is actually to just go forward, pursue this money. After all, it is Kenyan money. And we're talking about tens to hundreds of billions of shillings that could develop this country if recovered. There's no reason why we should abandon the fight, because also if you abandon it at this stage, all you're doing is giving crooks an advantage in perpetuity. and they will use that money to preserve their positions, and their positions will be to try and control politics and the economy.
Money laundering then continues to hang around the neck of the country like a millstone. Indeed, only when the evils of the past are done and dealt with will Kenya attain closure and be able to make a fresh start and then move on as a country.
Time for a break now, but when we return, electrical sockets made out of wood and the brains behind them. That and your question answered on the other side of this short break. Stay with KTN Business Weekly.
This week's story takes us to a slum in Thika town where one young man has discovered how to use locally available materials to solve problems for his community and make an income while at it. His business is premised on the fact that only a fifth of the Kenyan population has electricity, yet close to half of the same population uses a mobile phone. The phone charging business is a boom. Amos proudly takes us around his customers' shops, showing us custom-made sockets that he has designed. He provides light to homes and businesses inspired by his experience early in life when all he knew was darkness and poverty that led him to drop out of school many times.
I come from Gataga district in Kigesi sub-location. I went to school in Kigesi Secondary School. That was a day school. And I wanted so much to go to Gidum High School, but because of the school fees, I couldn't.
Amos' favorite subject in high school was physics, as he always wanted to become an electrical engineer, but when his dream to join university faded, Amos joined his brother-in-law's electrical business.
It was like an apprentice. After that, after 2 months, I discovered that I couldn't get enough money to feed myself and even to push on with this life.
Armed with his new innovation, Amos approached his area MP Peter Kenneth, who gave him 5,000 shillings as startup capital, and gigantic electronic inverters was born. To give back to society, Amos took up 3 young men from the slums whom he trained and now work in his workshop.
I had my extension cable in my room. It was overheating and then it was burned. I sat down that night and came up with something that is durable, something that can help mwananchi wa kawaida.
His biggest challenge was to convince potential clients that his wood multi-sockets were as good as the conventional plastics.
And even I was forced, as I made 2 or 3 I got to the market, I met few customers. They were being disturbed by the plastic ones, so they were overheating, and then they were discouraging them. So I forced to tell them that my product can work. I was forced to leave this gadget unto them.
To increase his margins, Amos sells his wares cheaper than plastic sockets, with prices ranging from 250 shillings to 500 shillings, and makes customized sockets. To cut on costs, he only uses local products.
In different sizes. So I do measure them and cut them into pieces. After that, I take the cover, that is plywood, and I measure those holes. Huwa natumia hii kifaa ambacho huwa kinaitwa mallet. Huwa ni lazima niwe very keen, kwa sababu ukimiss tu moja hiyo socket inaharibika. So you must be very keen. wakati natengeneza hiyo, sasa ni lazima nifanye ni drill na that electric drill ambayo mmeiona. After that huwa nafanya wiring hiyo kitu, na ili from one hole to the other, ili pass a current from one hole to the other. After that, ninapofanya hivyo, lazima hiyo moto, kuna kitu ambacho huwa tunaita meter ambao huwa natumia. Hiyo ndio huwa inapima voltage ya socket yenyewe yenye ita hold. Mine huwa ina range 240 to 41, na ni lazima make sure ya kwamba haipitishi below voltage, kwa sababu ikiwa below na ikiwa above voltage inaweza choma vitu.
His biggest market share is taken up by Thika and has ventured into Nairobi, Nyeri and Embu. Amos says his biggest challenge now is to keep up with the demand and is saving up to buy technology that will allow him to increase capacity to the larger East African market.
Vijana siku hizi wako jobless sana, na ningetaka kuchukua vijana ambao wako willing na vijana ambao wako na interest, kwa sababu kuwa huna interest huwezi jua hii course.
Amos is not afraid to share his knowledge and empower other young people, but has patented his idea to ensure his innovation is not stolen. We left Thika with a better understanding of Peter Drucker's quote that says, and I quote, "Innovation is the specific instrument of entrepreneurship, the act that endows resources with a new capacity to create wealth."
In the market report, the Kenyan economy grew by 4.9% in the first quarter of 2011, according to latest figures by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, while the rate of inflation stood at 14.49% in June from 12.95% in May. The rate of the 91-day Treasury bill is pegged at 8.95%, down from 8.99% in the previous auction, while the rate of the 182-day and 364-day papers is pegged at 9.85% and 10.22% respectively. The average bank lending rate as at the end of May stood at 13.88%, while the average bank deposit rate stood at 3.57%. At the Nairobi Stock Exchange, there are 4 stocks currently trading with dividends: BAT Kenya, Kapchorwa Tea, Williamson Tea, and Kenya Airways. On Your Question Answered, we tackled this question from a person who remains unnamed, and he wonders how ideal it is to venture into greenhouse farming. Everyone seems to be doing it, he says, and asks whether the Kenyan market can support it, or is it advisable to farm the traditional way?
Greenhouse farming actually is a climate change resilience strategy, because what happens is that you no longer continue to be dependent on rain for agriculture, and therefore you can use small amounts of water and ensure that you get a crop. The other advantage is that the problem with Kenyan farming is that when everybody plants, when the rain comes, the harvest comes all at the same time, which depresses prices. But with greenhouse farming, you can phase out your planting so that you know that your crop will be available when the market is not flooded, and therefore you'll be able to get good prices. So my own view is that greenhouse farming is the right way to go.
Well, thank you for your question. That's all that we had time for on this edition of KTN Business Weekly. Let's do it again next week. But remember that you can send in your comments or questions to the email address ktnbizweekly@standardmedia.co.ke or to the number on your screen, that's 8040. From the entire KTN Business Weekly desk, thank you very much for watching. And I'm Michael Oyer. I'll be back with KTN Prime shortly.